What is up, everyone? This is New World Economics here, and this is the December 12th Frontline update for the Russo-Ukrainian war. I just want to make a quick address real quick before we get started. I do read some of the comments, and I kind of want to address some comments on, I guess, like my motivations for doing this. There's some people obviously accuse me of being pro-Russian, and then there's also a lot of pro-Russian people that accuse me of being pro-Western. I'm not really trying to push an agenda one way or the other, whether you should support Russia or support Ukraine. Like that's the exact opposite of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to maintain some kind of neutrality here and give an objective view. I guess you could honestly say an objective amateur analysis of what's going on here. And to be completely honest with you, the information we get here it's basically a rumor mill. We tried to decipher it as best as we can to determine like what's going on in the battlefield in order to really understand the complete picture and the complete state of each army and each belligerent involved in this conflict. Like you honestly would have to be pretty close to the government or intelligence apparatus that's behind either side. And I'm obviously not, so I'm not going to get everything right. I just do my best based on the information that flows out of the area. I try to identify what I believe to be bullshit, what I believe to be true, and I try to use pretty even-handedly sources from each side. Not because I think each side is, basically just as honest as the other. It's really hard to make that determination. I just believe that in order to get the full picture, you have to take information from each side and compare it. And I think a lot of times when you do that, some things tend to add up. Like you'll get reports from, say, the Russian side that there's combat activity in a certain area, and then you'll get reports from the Ukrainian side that there's also combat activity in a certain area. So, that's both sides agreeing on something, and we have a confirmation of something that's actually happening on the battlefield. Those of you guys that watch the channel know this. You've seen this many times before where we've had information from both sides that actually lines up. Now, to determine, which way that fight is going is a little more difficult. It takes, in my opinion, takes a couple days to decipher what's really going on, who has the upper hand, who doesn't. Generally, you can tell that by different movements on the battlefield, but not always. There's definitely circumstances where one side, after a week of fight in a particular area, ends up gaining the upper hand and capturing ground. But that could just be because they donated more resources to it. Could mean they lost more resources in the capturing of that area compared to the defending side, or vice versa. It's tough to determine those things. A lot of that stuff's going to come out at the end of this conflict, I believe. Like what the true losses for each side were, what the true equipment losses are for each side, who had the upper hand in this or that. There's some pretty good opinions out there on these things right now, but we can get into those at a different time. I just wanted to address that real quick, let you guys know, I'm not in this for any particular cause that either side is fighting for. Obviously, each side has their own reasons for this conflict. The main takeaway is that war is terrible, and a lot of innocent people are dying either way. So, that's really what you should focus on is, the quicker this ends, the quicker the death, or the faster the death stops, the better this will be for everyone. So, without further ado, we're going to jump into the front line real quick. We're going to talk about one of these situations where we've had some issues determining who has the upper hand. So both sides pretty much confirm that this zone here, I guess you can say from Novovadian down to Chervona-Popivka, is enduring a bit of pretty heavy fighting, right? So there's a lot going on in this particular area here. The first thing that happened was it appeared like the Ukrainian side had made some kind of offensive push into Chervona-Popivka. At one point might have even occupied big parts of the town. The Russian side claimed that they had prevented them from capturing the town, but the road, this P66 highway going to Svatova, was under Ukrainian fire control. And the days following that, we have reports from the Russian side that they've managed to push the Ukrainian side back. The Russians are actually claiming that they're on the offensive along this entire front line, which isn't to say that they're just rolling up waves of infantry crashing into Ukrainian lines. It just simply means the frontline units are pushing. Whether or not they're taking heavy casualties for either side, that's obviously yet to be determined. We don't have information like that. And it's especially scarce getting information like that from the Russian side. Now, it does seem like there's a bit of truth to the story that the Russians have recovered a lot of their lost territory. In terms of what the Ukrainians are saying, they've basically been echoing the same point. Heavy battles in the area of Chervano-Popivka, heavy battles every day. The Ukrainian sources that I read are just reporting the same thing without any particulars of what's going on in this area. The only particulars that we're getting is coming from the Russian side, claiming that they're now on the offensive. Actually, the most recent claims are saying that both sides are on the offensive in this area. So rather than one side sitting back and playing a little defense, both sides are kind of just clashing head on. So there probably is the case of high casualties among both armies, really in this specific square here. It's just south of Ploshchenka. So, the Ukrainians are saying that the fighting is more or less in the area of Chervano-Popivka. The Russians are saying that the fighting is in the area south of Ploshchenka, and that they've recaptured some Ukrainian strongholds that the Ukrainians had captured from them. That's the story of this area. In terms of casualties, like I said, no idea what the casualties are like. I will move over to this map real quick to look at the unit designation so we can see who's fighting in this area and what the rumors have been in terms of casualties on the Ukrainian side, because we're just not getting this same specific information from the Russian side. Although I will say I have seen some footage and some pictures of the dire state of some of the Russian infantry on this side. It looks like this front is allegedly being held by the 1st Guards Tank Army, which we've heard many times before, took pretty heavy casualties early on in the war. It was supplemented with a lot of these early mobilized troops that did not get good training. And specifically, obviously a lot of these guys probably know how to fire a weapon and clean a weapon and things like this, but they didn't get terrain-specific training or an update in terms of don't start a fire at night, enemy artillery can spot you, or how to set up your positions, whatever it might be. The troops on the Russian side here are pretty green, and we have gotten some indicators that they probably are taking extremely heavy losses. But this is supplemented by a heavy amount of reinforcements that have been brought into this area. So for the Russian side, 1st Guards Tank Army comprises of 144th Motor, 4th Tank, 2nd Motor. I believe these are the two of the original units that made up this 1st Guards Tank Army. I'm not sure if the 144th was originally in there. And then you have the 752nd Motor Bars Infantry Battalion, which is supposedly one of the more elite groups on this front. This is the group that was holding out in Liman. Supposedly, there was just this group, and then maybe 500 to 1,000 more Russian troops in the area that managed to, I'm not going to say, I don't want to take away from the Ukrainians in terms of their maneuver, because they did manage to encircle Liman and deal some damage to the Russian side, but based on the Russian numbers in the area compared to the Ukrainian numbers, they did hold out for a surprising amount of time. This is a very motivated grouping right here. And then you have the 208th Motor Regiment here. So supposedly, at full strength, 10, 20, 25, 30, 31 or 32, 35. So, considering casualties and probably not as full strength, probably 30,000 Russian troops on this front line here, maybe less. give or take. In terms of the Ukrainian side, 14th Mechanized Brigade, this is one of the brigades we're getting word that has been experiencing heavy losses. And that's probably because up to the last week or so, most of the, or the last couple weeks really, most of the pushing here in this area. Let's see if we can get all this crap off here. It looks like I'm going to have to reload the page. But most of the pushing on this front was being done to the north, trying to capture this road here. And this 14th Mechanized Brigade, as well as this 92nd Mechanized Brigade, were carrying out those activities for the better part of like a month with no real progress made. So, I mean, the latest news that I have heard is that these are two of the Ukrainian units that have sustained casualties and are not participating in the current offensive actions in the region right now. There's also the 4th Tank Brigade, 109th Territorial Brigade, 80th Air Assault, 1st Tank Battalion of the 17th Brigade. Let's see, what was this again? 4th Tank Brigade. So, and then you have the 95th Air Assault, which seems to me to be a fresher unit, probably why they're at the head. You see at the head of this fight here. 66th Mechanized Brigade also, I believe, is probably a fresher unit in terms of how much use they've had on the front line so far. Most of the stories, and specifically these are coming from the Russians, but when they talk about units that they meet in the field, it's primarily these two mechanized brigades here, the 14th and the 92nd. So this 66th it probably hasn't seen a lot of frontline combat yet. And then we have the 103rd and the 81st Air Mobile Brigade, which was seeing some activity early on in this push, but it appears like they've been rotated back a little bit further. And then last but not least, 105th Territorial Defense Brigade. All right, so moving on past this front line. And another quick note here, this is probably going to be a longer episode if you haven't discovered already. I'm trying to go through and give you guys a good idea of what units are fighting on each side as best we can. I believe that once you get further south of that Svatova front, the information is a little more shoddy for the Russian side. This is I believe a pro-Ukrainian mapping source here. And well, I mean, just based off of looking at the key for it here, it has Ukrainian units and then enemy units. So it seems like it's probably a pro-Ukrainian mapping source. But, you know, we're going to try to go through that and give you guys a good updated feel of what's going on. Yeah, so there's probably not going to be a lot of editing done to this video. I have trouble uploading stuff more than 20 minutes onto my editing site. So, you know, the files are too big. All right, in the area of Bilogorovka, the Russian side is claiming that they've managed to capture some kind of Ukrainian defensive position in the area. It doesn't sound like the progress in this town is as big as the Russian side is claiming that it is. You know, the Russian side is claiming the town. Most recently, they were claiming the town was in the gray zone, and that you know, they basically forced the Ukrainian side out, and that the capture of the town is imminent. It appears like that's not necessarily true. Definitely, Ukrainian side still has positions in the town, and where the Russians have occupied a recent position, I have no idea. I mean, it could have very well been on the outskirts of town, like here, or, you know, we know there's some trench lines and stuff up on these cliffs, but, and of course there's a quarry here as well. It's probably a pretty good defensive position, but we really don't know what's going on here. Not many reports from either side. So this area here is an interesting one. It seems like the Russian side's made the most progress in this area here recently, and this is, I mean, best described as, say, the Russians are you know, dealing with a lot of excess combat power in this area. They, you know, whether it's because they freed up their units in Kherson, I don't think that it's the same units that came from Kherson that are fighting in this area. I think it's probably reserves that were being held back in, you know, whether it was in Zaporozhye or Donetsk region, you know, reserves that the Russians didn't want to commit to battle just in case there was some kind of Ukrainian breakthrough somewhere. Now that the Kherson front has been withdrawn, they basically have new reserves like those guys from Kherson that they can kind of set off to the side, give them a breather. If they need to plug them into the front line, they can. Similar to what the Ukrainian side is doing with their Kherson reserves. But I think that the troops, probably troops that were waiting in Bakhmut, or maybe even possibly freshly mobilized troops, have been moved into this area. And there's a mismatch in combat power. The Russians have an advantage in artillery. They have an advantage in positioning. And they're able to deal pretty heavy damage to the Ukrainian side. So we're starting to see basically, a point where, of course, the Ukrainians are dug in pretty well, and the Russians can keep on attacking the same positions over and over again. But, that could only yield so much success. It's probably more of a case of, the easiest path forward. Kind of like water on rock, so like they push in Soledar, they push in Bakhmut, have marginal success, so they decide to move to the south, move to the north, have more, they have success in the south, and then that success kind of stops, so they, move to the north, and then they have success up here, and that kind of stops, and then they rotate around to a different part of the line, which we're about to get to. But most recently here, the Russian side captured Yakovlivka, a town that's held out the entirety of the time since the fall of Pavlovka. The Ukrainian side's had a defensive position here for a long time. The Russians have never managed to capture it, unlike Bilogorovka, Nagorny, and Berestove, which have exchanged hands at what appears to be several times. Now, the fall of Yakovlivka has put Russian pressure on this small town of Vesele, which has one main road leading into it from Yakovlivka, which could give the Russian side the advantage in terms of supplying a fight here. Whereas there are some back roads leading out of Vesele to Rozdivka, Perzine, but those roads might be difficult to use in this around this time of year with this type of weather. All right. So it is possible. What I'm saying, it is possible that the Russian side, captures this town rather soon. Now we do have some word here from Bakhmut in the direct view of Bakhmut, like moving directly into town. So we'd had some word that there was some fighting in the area of Pidgorodny. It seems like that information was only semi-accurate. I'm not seeing a lot of updates that there's actual street fighting in Pidgorodny. What I'm seeing is in the area of Pidgorodny, and specifically this part of Bakhmut, it appears that there might be street fighting. So the Russian side, rather than moving towards Pidgorodny, which I've discussed before, I'm not really sure how advantageous of a position it is, because it's basically down in this little bowl here. Ukrainian side can probably keep moving troops and supplies through these forested areas into this town. It might be kind of difficult to capture, and once captured, it actually is a worse vantage point than the gas station is. Like it has a retracted field of view around it. Not that, obviously moving forward would be advantageous for the side that's moving forward, but this might be more costly than it's worth in terms of trying to extend out. You might get your, if you're trying to extend your arm out here, you might get it lopped off, if you know what I'm saying. So what the Russians appear to be doing is moving into this residential area right here, where the latest reports are that they've captured several streets or several houses and buildings in this area. So we are getting word of urban fighting. There's actually some video of urban fighting, which I'll try to bring up for you guys real quick since I'm not getting probably not gonna get a chance to video edit. Hold on a second, we'll pause. Alright, that looks like Marinka. This looks like... Alright, let me see. Probably should have had this video pulled up earlier for you guys. That way we could It might not have even been on Telegram. This might have been on YouTube that I saw somewhere, actually. But anyways, hopefully, maybe I can repost it separately if I can find it. Actually, yeah, I think it was a Reuters report, and it was, there was no words to it. It was basically video footage of fighting going on in the Bakhmut area. But there was some video there of some Ukrainian fighters fighting from inside a large building. And specifically, it was in Bakhmut. So it does tell us that urban fighting has actually hit Bakhmut. It is not solely on the outside and the outskirts of town. Another location that the Russian side has managed to push in is once again along this Patrice Lumumba Street. There's a specific area that's been captured by the Russian side. Whether that area extends to here and these factories in this area, or if it extends all the way up and covers these two factories, I'm not exactly sure. This is an area that the Russians have entered into before, but apparently got pushed out of earlier in the fight. And then finally, the final two locations that there has been some movement on the battlefield is then again in this area. It appears like the Russian side has captured a certain amount of ground here, and then in Opitny, they've captured positions somewhere up to a church, which you can zoom in a second. So you're starting to see the Russians are trying to probe into the town, get positions in the town in several different locations here. This tells us that, unlike before where they were just really pushing down Patrice Lumumba Street, there's definitely enough combat power and manpower for the Russian side in the area to try and sustain several different attacks in several different directions at the same time. Which is a bigger deal than you might think. Each attack has to be supported with artillery, potentially even air support. And if you got 4 of these attacks going on at the same time, you're looking at 4 different, battle groups that have their own artillery assigned, have their own, probably tank forces assigned to them. It's a big operation. So, definitely looks like some progress is being made for the Russian side. The Ukrainian side, it's obviously not over for them. There's some good defensive positions left in Bakhmut. Depending on the circumstance, myself and a lot of other people could be wrong. And the thought here is that, or the assumption we've been going off of is basically if the Russians break into town, the Ukrainian side's going to be forced to retreat. If they really wanted to, they could hold half the town, or they can draw a defensive line somewhere along the rail line here or something. Who knows? This battle could be pretty far from over. It could last all winter time. But just for clarity, we're going to zoom in down here. We're going to find where this church is. It appears like this church is right here. I'm not seeing another church in this area. It doesn't appear like they've made it past the hospital or the school yet. So, some of Opitnoy is in Russian hands. Most of it appears to be in Ukrainian hands. Now, to the south here of Kurdyumovka, there is some reports that the Russian side has been engaging in battles with the Ukrainian side somewhere in these fields, in these areas in between Kurdyumovka and Bilogorovka. So the reports are in the direction of Bilogorovka. The Russians are assaulting. How far they've made it, we don't know. There are some Ukrainian trench lines that can be viewed here from this point on Google Earth. Looks like some tank traps or some tank dugouts and stuff. Some pretty extensive fortifications in the area. I would assume that this position might have been eliminated if we're talking about Russian assaults in the direction of Bilogora, but we really don't know at this point. What is certain is probably the positions here on the outside of Kurdyumovka. These trench lines and everything right across the canal are probably under Russian control. Moving to the south, there are reports of heavy fighting. The Ukrainian side specifically is reporting that there's heavy fighting in the area of Vadian. They say the situation is difficult but under control. When one side says the situation is difficult but under control, I've heard this several times from the Ukrainians and the Russians. It usually means the situation is not under control, but we'll see. Last we knew here, the Ukrainian side was trying to counterattack, and I've actually heard rumors that in some areas, perhaps maybe in this area here, that the Ukrainian side has managed to counterattack and recapture some kind of fortification line that's actually on the Donetsk ring road. So if that were true, that would be a big development. But as far as we can tell, it seems like the Russian side is pretty well entrenched in the southern parts of Vadian here, specifically this small area right here. It seems like there's some pretty entrenched Russian troops in that area. The Ukrainians have tried to push them out. They haven't had any luck. The Russians are using this area to jump into this next part of town here, which supposedly will probably be used to jump into this part of town here. Not really sure, but we do know there are Russian positions there. I will adjust that for the map, actually, so we can not have to draw lines there next time. All right, so to the south here, there's some interesting developments actually on this line. The Ukrainian side is claiming some partial success in some counterattacks in this area, which I've adjusted the line here because I had prematurely moved up the front line to cover this entire road here, whereas what had really happened was the Ukrainian side had positions all the way down in Yegorovka, down here, and then the Russian side had pushed back just here in this area of Pavlovka and recaptured Pavlovka. That counterattack did not occur across this line, so that was my mistake. I hadn't actually seen an update on this part of the line, or I didn't pay attention to it. But the Ukrainian side is claiming they've had success to the south of Ugledar, pushing the Russians back. I'm guessing that probably means these areas just north of Pavlovka here. Perhaps they've pushed the Russians back from these areas. I'm not exactly sure. They claim the capture of a town that they said was in the gray zone. It actually starts with an L. I'm not sure of the name of it, but I tried to find it before the video started, or before I started making this video, and I was completely unsuccessful. I have no idea where this position is, but there are some similar claims on the Russian side that there is fighting in the area. So, you know, the Russians aren't saying anything specific about the fighting. They're just saying that there is fighting. The Ukrainian side is claiming success. We're going to go with what the Ukrainians are saying because the Russians are not denying Ukrainian success in the area. Now, finally, the last point we're going to talk about in terms of battlefield updates is Velilka Novosilka. There was kind of a surprise Russian offensive action in the area here, and the Ukrainians do have a claim for it. They claim that they had success in this area beating back a Russian attack. They say they destroyed a number of BMP-2s and a T-80 tank, I believe is what the claim was, but they don't make any claims about territorial losses in that claim. And what the Russians are saying is that they launched an assault and they crossed this road. Damn it. They crossed this road right here that goes from Vremka to Zelenopole. Now, you know, seems like a big deal. Oh, we've cut a road. That prevents a little bit of logistics moving around. The Ukrainian side probably wants to capture that back right away. But if you look at the area, I mean, the road is actually already cut. Like, it leads to Vremka, which is an outskirt of Velika Novosilka that Russia has had positions in for some time now. So for the Russians to move up and capture a little bit more of this roadway, really, in my mind, or my opinion, doesn't change the situation a lot. So, you know, if this is the progress that was made, let's say if Russia did manage to you know, make a little bit of a local breakthrough here and lost a large amount of heavy equipment doing it, you know, depends on who you ask, it probably could be sold as a victory for the Ukrainian side, honestly. You know, no towns captured. You know, although I will say that, you know, large vehicles all the time are destroyed on the front line, and, you know, perhaps to lose 5 or 6 pieces of heavy equipment and taking this much ground is actually a favorable exchange. I'm not exactly sure. You know, compared to some instances or most days where there's no progress in the front line, yet you're still taking attrition in terms of heavy equipment. All right, so that's the updates for today. Thanks everyone for stopping by. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.